Hey guys, tonight we will open the heavy doors of the Tudor court and follow King Henry VIII through his final winter. Those foul-smelling leg ulcers that even herbal scents could not mask. The pulley system suspended from the rafters used to hoist the king from room to room. The widened palace doors and reinforced throne, all just to support a body betraying its owner. You'll hear whispers about his massive diet heavy with meat, pies, wine, and ale, and about the primitive medicine of the era, red-hot irons pressed against wounds, poultices mixed with arsenic and mercury, leeches clinging to skin to draw out the poison. Then comes the obsession with being poisoned. Every meal had to be tasted first, and the royal kitchen was scrutinized down to each spoon. As fear ballooned, a death sentence could still be issued just days before the king's last breath. At the edge of the sickbed, you'll see the king gently squeeze Archbishop Cranmer's hand as his final response. And when the coffin was brought into the chapel, legend says a foul liquid seeped onto the stone floor, drawing in stray dogs, a scene that stripped away the mask of royal power. Finally, the funeral took him to Windsor, laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, but his legacy would pass on to the short-lived Edward, the embattled Mary, and Elizabeth I, who would usher in a golden age, an immense irony of history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Perhaps, when you have let your room sink into the glow of dim lights, with the gentle hum of a fan in the background, like the distant soundtrack of an old tale, your mind begins to drift away from daily clamour and slowly journeys back to a realm of memories where history feels more vivid and intimate than ever. Tonight, instead of simply recounting a distant event, I invite you to become a stranger wandering into the royal chapel of the 16th century, where time seems suspended between cold stone walls, and the greatest secrets are hidden beneath velvet drapes and layers of heavy perfume. Don't be too quick to think that this is merely the story of kings, for what you're about to sense has nothing to do with crowns or power, but with something deeply human: finitude, fragility, and the moment when everything we thought was immortal quietly becomes a memory dusted with time. So, let's take a single step together slowly, softly, as if afraid to stir the heavy silence in the air. And then, you notice the scent before you see the coffin, a strong, oppressive odor, as if it wants to claw at your throat. This is not the scent of incense or herbs that the courtiers have used to mask the air, but the true smell of death itself, of gases and fluids built up for so long in a wooden box made to hide secrets. Now powerless against what's happening inside, all you need to do is stand here, in this chapel, bathed in flickering candlelight, hearing the hushed whispers and glimpsing the shadows of cloaks passing by. And you know well that the ending of Henry VIII is nothing like the tales of glory you've heard. There is a legend that, on that night, stray dogs slipped into the chapel and licked up the liquid that leaked from the coffin onto the stone floor. You don't know whether that's true, but the way everyone avoids each other's gaze, the way the attendants quietly wipe the floor with scented cloths, is more than enough to impress upon you the feeling of a silent humiliation that no amount of power can conceal. You remember the portraits from the king's youth, the golden-haired prince, broad-shouldered, tall, with radiant eyes, striding regally beneath majestic vaulted ceilings. You imagine that figure, then compare it to the swollen, ulcerated, foul-smelling body you witness now, and you suddenly see how fragile, how breakable, all that royal splendor truly is. You realize this is not just the death of another king, but the slow unraveling of a man who once believed himself chosen by God, who thought he could shape the fate of a kingdom with a single command. Yet, in the end, he too could not escape the laws of flesh and blood. You look around, seeing legendary tapestries hanging on the walls. You see the courtiers walking softly, speaking in hushed tones. Everyone as if afraid to touch on something forbidden. Here, even predicting the king's death was once considered treason. Enough to send a person to the scaffold. Everyone carries an air of tension and caution. For all understand that, when a dynasty comes to such an end, the greatest secrets inevitably rise to the surface. Nothing can be hidden forever. You follow the thread of this story from days of radiant glory to utter decay. From absolute power held in one's grasp, to the helplessness of watching your own body rot away piece by piece. You see that the mask of power, gilded by ritual and applause, is more fragile than people think. It cannot cover up the smell of death leaking from the coffin, cannot hide the ulcers on the legs, nor save a mind shattered by paranoia and endless pain. You stand still, letting the scents of herbs and decay swirl together, truly feeling the heavy silence of the chapel at night. You draw from it a lesson at once, simple and profound. A crown might make others tremble, but it cannot stop the cells from decaying. A title may change the laws of an entire nation, but it cannot rewrite time or destiny. And in this moment, you suddenly understand every distance between king and servant, between power and fate, between legend and reality is erased. In the end, everyone is just human, left with only a finite body and an ending, whether quiet or tumultuous. All ultimately belong to that final equality that death brings. You draw back the curtain of time and see Henry at his peak. The king's figure shines in the great halls of the palace, standing tall, shoulders broad, arms muscular, the very image of the ideal prince that all of Europe once admired. Henry was just over 30 then, his face still bearing the delicate features of youth, his wide smile, and his voice echoing through banquets that stretched late into the night. People used to say he bested countless opponents in jousting tournaments, galloped horses as fast as the wind, wielded his lance with force and skill, making every gaze turn toward him, in a mix of admiration and awe. Then came a fateful day, in the year 1536, amidst a raucous jousting festival. The thunder of hooves pounded the earth. Metal armor clashed, sending chills through the crowd. And once again, Henry appeared, striking atop his warhorse as always. But this time, a violent fall occurred. His head struck the ground hard, and he was rendered unconscious, sending shock and horror through the courtiers and the public. It took a very long time to bring him back to his chambers, and the king slipped into a coma. That fall was not merely a physical accident. Many modern doctors believe it left a lingering, silent brain injury, like a small crack in a great stone foundation, waiting only for time to widen it. From that moment on, you notice Henry gradually becoming a different man. He was no longer the gentle king of his 20s. Just a single word of disagreement, a strange look, or even a misplaced smile could spark his anger or trigger immediate punishment. Most strikingly, the suspicion grew inside his mind like weeds overrunning a garden, erasing any clear lines between friend and foe. Where once Henry liked to listen to political discussions in the Great Hall, after the accident, he often shut himself away in his private chamber, receiving only his closest confidants. Orders were issued at lightning speed, but then could be suddenly reversed, leaving the entire court wary of every word spoken. You stand in the grand hall, feeling the suffocating atmosphere of power. If in the past, the king's smile was the sign of a good day, now every sharp look from him makes everyone bow their heads, holding their breath as they walk by, fear seeping into every breath and every glance. Small talk gradually disappeared. Guards became more numerous. Corridors grew more silent. Everyone knew the court's tune had changed affection, and trust had retreated, replaced by suspicion and a constant, uneasy anxiety. You hear Anne Boleyn's name come up repeatedly in closed meetings, once a symbol of love, then made a scapegoat for Henry's impulses and obsessions. Accusations of adultery and treason, though considered fabricated by many, were still used as pretexts to silence all dissent. The boundary between reason and obsession blurred. Politics became nothing more than an excuse for unstable emotions to erupt. One physical fall led to a reign dominated by fear and mutual surveillance. You walk through cold corridors, your hand brushing thick stone walls, sensing the loneliness of power. The more guards appear, the fewer words are spoken. The more new decrees are issued, the fewer genuine feelings are shown. The whole kingdom seems suffocated under the heavy shadow of the king's suspicion. From here, every major or minor decision Henry made seemed marked by the scar of that old wound. Some days, he would sign dozens of edicts in a row, punishing one, rewarding another, only to reverse them the next day, banishing even his close confidants. Every fluctuation in his mind rippled through the entire power structure when cheerful. There was amnesty. When grim, a purge. When optimistic, feasts. When anxious, lockdowns. Absolute power, when placed upon a fractured mind, becomes a magnifying glass, amplifying fear until every shadow becomes a threat. In those long nights within the vast palace, you patiently connect the dots like a meticulous chronicler from the fall in the year 1536 to the political storms, the insecurity, the unjust deaths. A straight line of tragedy unfolds before your eyes. The image of the ideal Renaissance prince has drifted off course, and the whole court must hold its breath and shift according to the winds of change blowing from within the mind of a king, both powerful and deeply, desperately fragile. You picture the numbers first: that once trim waist of about 89 centimeters now ballooned beyond 130, his weight surging past 180 kilograms. Each step for the king has become a negotiation with pain, a slow, rattling journey from one corner of his world to the next. Look up, and you see the thick ropes and the pulley system straining under the ceiling beams, groaning as the servants haul the king across rooms. The palace itself seems to have reshaped around him, doorways forced wider, the throne's legs reinforced to hold his massive frame. It's as if the entire royal household has become a single, lumbering machine, all in service of transporting a body that has, over time, turned traitor against its master. Step into the kitchens and the pattern is clear plates stacked with roasted meats, hearty pies, pitchers of red wine and ale vegetables rare, exercise nearly non-existent, 5,000 calories a day building up, layer by layer, turning flesh into a weight that crushes knees. Clocks Vines slows the heart. You glance at his legs and see the results swollen and blistered, ulcerated and bandaged. The wrappings always damp with pus. Every bandage change is a test of endurance. Every attempt to move a gamble against agony. Here, humiliation doesn't lie only in numbers or size, it's in the dependence, raw and undeniable, on the hands of others. The king who once ruled with a glance must now rely on his attendants for the simplest acts to shift his weight, to rise from the bed, to cross a threshold. The air, once thick with perfume and power, is now laced with another scent-rotten medicine in equal measure. You hear his laboured breathing echo down the corridors, mingling with the whisper of silk, and you know that dignity is being whittled away. Little by little, with every day that passes. It's a cruel paradox. The very body that once symbolized Henry's vigor and authority has become his prison, locking him inside a world of pain and embarrassment. Step back, and the palace transforms pulleys, levers, reinforced chairs. Endless bandages all become pieces of a grand, tragic apparatus. Absolute power demands a palace that runs like clockwork. But now, that mechanism is devoted to propping up its failing master, exposing the limits of power itself. There is no command, non royal decay, that can halt the relentless decay of flesh. You sense, with mounting certainty, that before enemies could topple him, before plots or poisons could do their work, it was Henry's own body that brought him low. The king's downfall didn't begin with treachery in council or betrayal at court. It started quietly, inexorably. Within, every swollen joint, every ulcer that refused to heal, every groan behind closed doors, these were the real harbingers of an ending written not by the pen, but by the body's own mutiny. And as you stand amid the creak of ropes, the rustle of bandages, the soft, measured steps of servants moving a weight once carried with ease, you realize power may change laws and shape destinies. But in the end, it is helpless before the silent rebellion of the flesh. You watch as the treatments unfold before your eyes, each one making your heart tighten a little more. The physicians bring out their tools, and you see the iron glowing red-hot, its surface trembling in the dim candlelight, before it is pressed directly against a festering ulcer meant to sear the wound shut, but only adding another layer of pain atop pain. Sometimes they smear thick, sticky poultices across the king's skin, concoctions laced with arsenic and mercury, ingredients chosen with hope, but more likely to poison than to heal. And then there are the leeches, dozens at a time, their cold bodies clinging to royal flesh, drawing out blood in a desperate ritual to balance the humours. As the old masters called it, you hear the quiet hiss of burning flesh, a sound that seems to echo all the way down the stone corridors. You see Henry's face contract, contorting in agony after each bloodletting, his lips white, sweat shining on his brow. The pungent odour of strong ointments tries to wrestle with the ever-present smell of decay. Together, they weave through the hallways, curling beneath closed doors and lingering in every room. You understand? Watching this grim procession, that the doctors mean no harm. They are simply bound by the limits of their era, wielding ignorance as much as hope. But their limitations become a saw, steadily slicing away what little strength the king still clings to. Each treatment is not a step toward light, but another retreat into shadow. Servants pass by, pinching their noses, their faces twisted in polite misery. Some scurry to spray sweet-smelling waters along the walls. Others tie up bundles of dried herbs above each window. But all these efforts are but a thin defense against a verdict already delivered. You realize, in their flurry of ritual and fragrance, that they are not fighting fate. They are performing a last-ditch masquerade, an attempt to preserve some scrap of dignity in a world crumbling at the edges. As night settles in, the palace becomes thick with silence. Somewhere in the distance, you catch the faintest moan, a pain-racked sound, barely rising above a whisper. You sense the weight of darkness growing heavier, pressing down with every passing hour. The physical agony is no longer confined to Henry's body. It seeps outward, infecting every corner of the court. When pain stretches beyond its limit, you learn it does not just cripple the body, it cracks the mind. 2. Fear surges up. Riding on the back of pain, anger lashes out at shadows. Trust evaporates in the midnight air. In the one light of a sputtering lamp, you see a man no longer at the helm of his destiny. Henry is no longer master of his court, or even of himself. He has become a vessel for suffering, moving not by will, but by the relentless commands of pain. Around him, the business of the realm still sputters along. Physicians prescribe, servants bandage, scribes draw up decrees, priests mutter prayers, maids douse the halls in perfume. But it all feels mechanical, hollow, as if the court has turned into a marionette show performing for no one but the dying king. You stand quietly among these swirling scents, caught between herbs and putrefaction, and you begin to see history sometimes advances not with the thunder of marching boots, but with the limp and stagger of a wounded leader. Those who rule may set the direction, but their private agonies pull the rest of the world back. Step by step, decisions inked on parchment can move nations. Yet all too often, those same hands leave stains of sweat and blood on a pillow in the dark. And in this midnight hush, you hear the slow tick of an invisible clock, one notch closer, one inexorable step toward an end no crown can prevent. You learn to speak softly, to step lightly, because you know that even a sideways glance might be twisted into evidence. At banquet, you watch the food taster carefully touch his lips to every dish before it goes near the king. Knives, forks, and goblets are scrutinized under the candlelight. Every movement becomes an anxious ritual, choreographed by the old king's obsession with poison. Plates are passed, then examined, then tasted, and only then served a ballet of suspicion stretching deep into the night. You stand back and read the order for the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, signed just 9 days before the king himself would die. The chill runs through you, even in the last spasms of power. Henry's word is enough to send a loyal nobleman to his death. Rumours filter through the corridors. The king has suffered a series of small strokes. His memory slips. His moods crash like waves in a storm. But most of all, you see the fog of paranoia thickening around every wall. Anyone can be an enemy now. Even you. If your eyes linger too long. If your silence is misunderstood. The palace itself is transformed into a labyrinth. The air is heavy with layers of perfume, desperately masking the underlying rot. The sounds of hastily signed decrees, the scratch of quills, and the shuffling of documents become a nervous soundtrack that never ceases. Fear is contagious here. Conversations shrink. People speak less, look down more, barely even breathe. The old bonds of loyalty are replaced by the instincts of survival. No one trusts. Everyone endures. The court, once united by shared purpose, now dances to the tempo of anxiety, every heartbeat echoing with the threat of accusation. You realize now that the tragedy of the king's body has intertwined with the tragedy of his rule. Pain distorts the mind. A mind unbalanced writes cruel verdicts. Those verdicts then isolate the king further, feeding his own fear. The cycle tightens, each turn bringing Henry closer to the edge of his own unraveling. You walk down stone corridors, your footsteps echoing cold and hollow, a reminder that every sound here is measured, every breath a calculation. Even the man who made others tremble now trembles himself, afraid of his meals, afraid of the dark, afraid of friends who might become traitors, and most of all, afraid of his own failing body. In the flicker of candlelight, the royal court, a place once lit by pageantry and certainty, has shrunk into a shadowed chamber where secrets cannot stay buried, and every corner is a potential threat. You feel it all pressing in the stale air. The watchful eyes, the ceaseless routines meant to protect, but only deepening the sense of dread. Here, no one is truly safe. Not the courtiers, not the cooks, not even the king. Every action is weighed, every word is measured. You learn that, at the end of power, silence is the only shield that still works. The palace, once a stage for triumphs and dazzling feasts, has become a kind of holding cell for everyone inside. At its center sits a king no longer in command of his destiny, besieged not by foreign enemies, but by the relentless, inescapable approach of his final reckoning. The world he built is narrowing, closing in. The music of glory now replaced by the low hum of survival and the chill of waiting. And in that waiting, you see, clearer than ever, that the greatest fear does not lie outside, but deep within a fear that not even the mightiest crown can hold at bay. You draw a deep, icy breath of the winter of 1546 to 1547 and feel the chill settling into your bones, the same way sickness has crept into Henry's flesh and blood. Fevers rise and fall, never truly breaking. Each breath seems weighted, as if a stone rests upon his chest. And the king's legs, gnawed by gangrene, turn blacker each week, exuding a stench that even the court's finest perfumes cannot mask. You stand quietly in the corner, as the courtiers spray more scented water, hang bunches of dried herbs in every window. But nothing can truly subdue the odour of death that thickens the air. In the silent gloom, you hear the king mumbling through bouts of delirium. Sometimes Jane Seymour's name slips out, a pleading call to the only wife who gave him a son. At other times, you almost catch the name Anne Boleyn, her shadow lingering between guilt and regret. A ghost Henry cannot exorcise. You watch the servants gesture silently to one another, moving with a care that verges on fear. For even a dropped spoon or a voice too loud might send the king into agony. Every conversation is hushed, every footstep careful, because in these halls, even predicting the king's death is an act of treason. So everyone puts on the mask of hope. Physicians prescribe new tonics and remedies. Priests murmur prayers at the bedside, and the great lords muster brittle smiles for the sake of appearances. The court calendar shrinks. Audiences are cancelled or delayed. The royal physician's notes grow thicker and more desperate. And behind heavy doors, secret councils debate the matter of succession. You sense, above all, the king's loneliness. Once surrounded by eager courtiers and loyal attendants, Henry is now avoided, his sickbed attended out of duty. Not affection. The foul air drives even the most devoted away. Night after night, you wander the corridors and feel the wind coiling through the shutters. Cold and sharp, every step echoes the shrinking of time, the ticking away of days as winter deepens and the king's strength wanes. In the flickering candlelight, you watch him gasping for air, cold sweat beading on his brow, his trembling hand clutching the bed curtains as if to anchor himself to this world for just a few more hours. There is a fragility to everything now. The king's body, the court's discipline, even the illusion of royal omnipotence. The weight of the silence becomes almost unbearable. No one dares utter the truth that each day Henry slips further from power and life. Instead, everyone acts their assigned part in this theatre of denial, pretending not to notice the evidence that accumulates in every sickly breath and in every fevered whisper. And you, standing by, realize that the end is coming not with a shout, but with a series of soft, exhausted gasps, a slow unravelling that leaves the great king more isolated with every passing moment. You understand that winter is not just outside the windows, but inside the king himself, freezing his blood and dimming his spirit. The long, cold nights press in, and in the stillness, you bear witness to the slow extinguishing of a once blazing flame. The hands that once signed edicts, pointed in judgment, or lifted a sword, now cling to a blanket in the darkness, powerless against the world's oldest, most implacable foe. You watch the king's world contract fewer visitors, more shadows. The court's bustling life, reduced to careful tiptoeing, even the grandest of men, it seems, must face the end in a room filled with silence and dread, surrounded not by adulation, but by the scent of dying herbs and the throb of his own failing heart. And so, in this frozen chamber, Henry's final winter draws to its close, a lesson in the ultimate loneliness of power, the cold arithmetic of time, and the unyielding truth that all flesh, even that of kings, must yield at last to the dark. You sense the exact boundary of the end when Henry's eyes suddenly grow clear and distant, like someone hearing a bell toll from far away. On the evening of January the 27th, 1547, you see the courtiers murmuring among themselves, finally summoning Archbishop Thomas Cranmer into the room. You press yourself against the cold wall, watching the king try to gather himself for a final act. simple but sacred, his frail hand tightening around Cranmer's as the Archbishop asks if he dies in the Christian faith. Not a word, only the gentle pressure of a hand, his last gesture, still strong enough to cross the gulf of pain and send a message of will. After that, silence. You listen to the quiet crackle of embers in the hearth, the faint rustle of linen as servants adjust the bedding, the strained breath of someone stifling a sob. In the pre-dawn darkness of January the 28th, Henry's breath thins like mist, until at last it ceases altogether. You feel the room grow heavier, as if an unseen stone has been set upon every heart. No one dares weep aloud, for the etiquette of the court demands that emotion must wait its turn after ritual and rank. You remain still as a courtier goes from candle to candle, snuffing them all but one for prayer, for dignity, for a moment to mark the passing. You know, with that final exhalation, an age of fire and thunder has closed its doors. And yet, you also know that a king's death is never just a death. It is the flip of a switch on the machinery of power. The starting shot for all the contests. The true test of loyalty in the void that follows. Right there, as the attendants draw a heavy shroud over his body. The irony settles around you. The man who rewrote the laws of a whole kingdom could not rewrite the oldest law of all. The law of nature and of endings. Outside, the sky is a dull, grey parchment, still unwritten, waiting for the next hand to shape it. Inside your mind, one phrase takes shape and lingers. A king dies just like any other man. And the only thing that remains is how the living choose to tell his story. In the hush that follows, you sense the first stirrings of ambition and anxiety among those left behind, each preparing to claim or to mourn. But for this moment, the world is suspended. You are left with the weight of finality and the thin glow of a single candle, marking the spot where power, for all its armour, must yield at last to the silence of death. You watch as the embalmers begin their solemn work under the grey half-light of a mournful morning. One by one, they remove the internal organs, packing the empty cavity with pungent herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, layering them thick in the hope that nature might be delayed. If only for a while. Linen is wound around the swollen limbs, each pass of the cloth slower than the last, as if the ritual itself could grant some dignity back to what time and illness have taken. Spices and resins are scattered over the skin, but the work is difficult and hurried, because both the king's sheer size and the steady march of decomposition are enemies no amount of ceremony can truly defeat. The coffin, specially made and hastily assembled, is hammered together, the lid sealed with wax and thick nails. Even then, if you sense the tension, everyone knows the clock is ticking, that the body inside is already slipping beyond the reach of tradition and grace. The coffin is moved into the chapel, where it will wait for the grand funeral rites, guarded by flickering candles and the cold, watchful eyes of tradition. You linger after the others have left, drawn to the one truth nobody wants to face. You notice it first as a glisten at the joints between wooden planks, a dark liquid, the sign of gases and fluids building up within, beginning to seep outward under pressure. The palace's great machine, for all its power, cannot contain the simple chemistry of the end. Night falls, and you hear it, the light, furtive footfalls of stray dogs slipping through a side door. They sniff the air, drawn by an instinct older than kings, and find the puddle forming beneath the coffin. Tongue lolling, they lap at the foul liquid. A scene at once obscene and pitiful. You shiver not just at the sight itself, but at the message hidden within it, a telegram from nature, delivered directly to the edifice of power. All gilded surfaces, no matter how carefully preserved, will one day crack and peel. No layer of gold is proof against rot and damp. At dawn, the servants hurry to clean the floor, mopping away what they can. lighting more incense, draping the walls with heavier cloth. But the smell clings to the stone persistent, unérasable, like memory itself. As the court chroniclers record these moments, you realize this scene will drift into legend. Maybe it will be exaggerated, maybe doubted, but it will remain. People need a single, vivid image to make sense of a truth that is hard to face. The fate of power is always the body, and the body always loses to time. You leave the chapel, a quiet ache settling inside you. Last night, this was still a palace. This morning, it has become a lesson. A single line reverberates in your mind. Death does not hate. Death simply does its work. And sometimes, it sends stray dogs to tap on the door of human pride. In the silence that follows, the world seems to pause each stone, each breath, each flicker of candlelight, bearing witness not to the glory of a dynasty, but to the honest, leveling touch of mortality. And as you walk away, you sense that the truest history is written not in marble or gold, but in these fragile, fleeting moments when the great are brought quietly, irrevocably. Lo, you stand along the funeral route on February the 16th, 1547, as the slow procession grinds towards St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The air is thick with incense, the chants of priests rising and falling, the banners trailing in somber waves, a perfect mechanical rhythm, each part turning solemnly. The entire machine of ritual moving forward with careful gravity. You watch the specially made coffin lowered into its resting place beside Jane Seymour, the woman who gave Henry his only legitimate son. For a moment, the paradox pierces through all the pageantry, so many brutal choices made to protect a male succession. Yet, in the end, the crown would pass through the hands of daughters. You let the years turn. As if flipping the pages of a book, Edward VI, the boy for whom so much was risked, bargained, and lost, sits on the throne only a few short years before dying, still very young. Then Mary I rises, determined to draw England back into the arms of Rome. And at last, Elizabeth I, the daughter of the Queen who was executed on false charges, ascends, beginning a new and dazzling age. You hear preachers declare the hand of God in history. But you, having witnessed the embalming chamber and the chapel floor stained with dark streaks, reflect quietly. History is an odd, sometimes brutal combination of human will, random chance, and the relentless passage of time. Even as the choir's voices soar beneath the high stone vaults, you cannot forget the silence of those long nights standing guard over the coffin. The grander the funeral, the sharper the lesson power can design rituals, but it cannot design outcomes. The wheel of dynasty turns on, but today's clouds of incense only mask a simple truth tomorrow. Everyone must lie down just the same. You watch the crowds file past, faces blurred by smoke and sadness, each person clutching their own interpretation of what they have seen. No amount of ceremony can truly fix the shape of an ending. The banners will be packed away, the songs will fade, and the stones of Windsor will hold the memory of this king, just as they have held all the others. Each reign is a brief passage, sometimes triumphant, sometimes tragic, but every king is finally brought level, as the earth claims its own and the stories are left for others to tell. As the last notes of the choir echo away and dusk settles over the castle, you sense that history's most profound lessons are the ones whispered quietly, half forgotten at the edge of ritual. There, at the threshold between ceremony and silence, you find the only certainty, no matter how grand the procession, the end is always the same. You return to your room, settling in by the dim glow of a single candle, and begin to arrange everything you have seen into a quiet story for yourself. You remember the regal portraits of Henry, the heavy cloak, the unwavering gaze, the posture that brooked no defiance. Then, in your mind's eye, you set those grand images beside the final scenes, the pulleys groaning under his weight. The acrid sting of mercury ointment, bandages soaked with pus, the damp chill of the chapel's stone floor. Between these two pictures, you sense the full truth of what it means to be human when absolute power meets chronic illness. The mind can twist, compassion can dry up, and a court can transform into a furnace of fear. You recall the words of an English historian, "The greatest paradox of Henry's life is that he began as a prince of promise and ended as a warped shadow of himself." You find yourself nodding not because of the grandeur of his tragedy, but because of the quiet universality that lies beneath it. This story does not exist merely to startle, but to soothe. In the privacy of your thoughts, you whisper to yourself what you would like to say to anyone listening before sleep. No one can rewrite the laws of the flesh. No throne grants immunity from decay. And even the most splendid image of power is only a painted layer, destined to peel away in time. You remind yourself, if death is the great equalizer, then life ought to be lived with more fairness, with less tyranny, with fewer abuses of the fleeting authority any of us may hold. You gently blow out the candle, letting the soft darkness settle in all around you. In that hush, you feel as if you hear a door quietly close behind you. One dynasty has ended, but a lesson has just begun. You close your eyes, carrying with you the fading scent of herbs and the echo of a distant choral hymn, ready to accept that sleep itself is a kind of rehearsal for that last thing which awaits us all, even kings. Here, in the stillness of your own room, the story lingers as a balm, a reminder that every reign is temporary, every life bounded, and every heart, sooner or later, learns the humility that comes with letting go. But before you drift into sleep with that lesson, pause for a moment to look deeply at the real person behind the mask of power, for when the last glimmer of the candle fades away, you may find yourself wondering, how could a king who once wore a mighty crown become so vulnerable before time, illness, and decay? When history strips away the layers of glamour, what emerges from the everyday habits and private flaws that quietly inscribe themselves onto the fate of an entire dynasty? Then you will realize behind every throne is a person filled with weaknesses, concessions, small but dangerous preferences, and countless misguided choices. It is precisely these bad habits repeated year after year that gradually pulled him from the throne, transforming the image of a radiant prince into that of a deeply tragic king. So, as the night deepens, let us together shine a light on those very bad habits of Henry one by one, part by part, to understand why a great king could ultimately be defeated on the very battlefield of his own life. Bad habit number 1: gluttony and excessive indulgence in lavish feasts. When people mention Henry VIII, they often recall his imposing portraits, the grand decisions that shook all of Europe. Yet few know that one of his most harmful habits began right at the dining table. For decades during his reign, Henry was famous for his love of feasting, willing to host extravagant banquets that lasted from evening until the early hours of the next day. His table was always overflowing with red meats, game, pheasant, roasted goose, salsicus, sweet pastries, cheese, and all manner of the finest white breads. Meanwhile, vegetables and fruits, foods considered healthy, were often neglected, almost absent from his menu. Henry consumed an average of about 5,000 calories a day, which is 2 or 3 times the need of an ordinary person. Beyond the food, wine and beer flowed endlessly from silver jugs, turning every dinner into a lavish display of power and the wealth of the dynasty. For Henry, eating was not simply enjoyment, it was an affirmation of status, a way to show off the abundance and provision of a king above 10,000 others. However, behind these splendid banquets were serious health consequences. Henry became increasingly obese, his waistline expanding from 89 centimeters in youth to more than 130 centimeters in old age. His body weight surpassed 180 kilograms, making him unable to move by himself and forcing him to rely on a special pulley system and attendants to help him from one room to another. Worse still, this self-indulgence at the table drew Henry into a downward spiral of illness, digestive problems. Gout, high blood pressure, leg ulcers, and even bone necrosis became increasingly severe. Though doctors warned him many times, he could never give up this habit. By the end of his life, the glorious feasts were just memories for the servants, while Henry himself had to endure constant pain and isolation in his final years. Lavish banquets, once symbols of royal power, ultimately only deepened the tragedy of a king brought to ruin by his own appetite. After the layers of fat and wine, you will find a different Henry, one who is coarse, quick-tempered, and whose second bad habit would continue to carve deeper the tragedy of his reign. Bad habit number 2, rude communication and quick temper. After the fateful fall in the year 1536, Henry VIII became a man marked by volatility and a short temper, so different from the charming prince he once was. If the first bad habit was hidden under layers of feasts and indulgence, then the second revealed itself in every word and gesture, casting a constant shadow over court life. In Henry's palace, even a glance he didn't approve of, or the smallest bit of disagreement could trigger a furious outburst. He might shout, insult, or even hurl objects at courtiers or servants if he felt slighted or doubted their loyalty. These fits of anger erupted not only behind closed doors, but sometimes right in the middle of crowded banquets or public celebrations, turning the air of the royal household into something as tense as a drawn bow. Henry became notorious for punishing anyone who dared to cross him. Whether they were lifelong confidants or the most powerful nobles in England, some records describe how he would order people imprisoned, interrogated, or dismissed instantly for saying the wrong thing or simply laughing at the wrong moment. This unpredictable temper meant that even his wives and closest advisors lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when they might be the next target of royal wrath. Moreover, Henry's rudeness often went beyond anger. He humiliated or shamed those who had served him faithfully for years, all because of minor mistakes. This lack of emotional control didn't just shatter personal relationships, but also fostered an atmosphere of fear, coldness, and suspicion within the court. When dealing with foreign envoys and diplomats, Henry didn't hesitate to unleash biting sarcasm or outright insults, sometimes damaging England's position on the international stage. The consequences of such rudeness and hot temper were clear: a court in perpetual disorder, with everyone nervously guarding their words and actions, becoming ever more cautious and sycophantic. Henry himself grew increasingly isolated, unable to trust anyone, relying only on his own authority to suppress the growing sense of insecurity within. This, too, became a root cause of his eventual decline, as the king lost the image of an exemplary ruler and slipped deeper into the tragedy of his own making. As you move past the raised voices and slammed doors, you begin to sense another habit, festering quietly in the background, one of suspicion, watchfulness, and fear, a third bad habit that would slowly turn the palace into a prison of its own. Bad habit number 3. Pathological suspicion and extreme surveillance. Leaving behind the storms of anger and harsh words, you find the court of Henry VIII sinking into a deeper chill, the quiet, creeping dread of distrust. If a sharp tongue could cut, suspicion could suffocate. And so, Henry's third bad habit, which became especially pronounced in his later years, was his almost pathological suspicion and obsession with personal safety. After his physical and mental decline, Henry's faith in those around him, whether courtiers, family, or even trusted doctors, dwindled to almost nothing. Every meal, every goblet of wine, even a simple cup of water had to be tasted by someone else before reaching the king's lips. The royal cutlery, plates, and goblets were all carefully inspected under bright candlelight, and no one dared rearrange or touch these items without Henry's permission. But suspicion did not end at the table. It stretched into every corner of the palace, Henry set up elaborate surveillance among his servants, guards, and even high-ranking nobles, constantly changing his movements without warning, and sometimes making surprise inspections of rooms and corridors to catch anyone plotting against him. He ordered the construction of secret chambers and underground passages in case he needed to escape or hide, though the real danger was often imagined more than real. No one was allowed to remain in his confidence for long. Favourites were frequently replaced, and anyone suspected was interrogated or harshly punished. Such habits transformed the royal household into a landscape of anxiety. Trust evaporated. Every gesture, every word, every sideways glance could be twisted into evidence of treachery. Even those closest to Henry, his wives, his oldest friends, could quickly become victims of his suspicion. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were both executed on little more than flimsy accusations or Henry's own uneasy feelings. In the end, this bad habit of suspicion and extreme surveillance did more than isolate Henry. It pushed the whole court into a spiral of fear, deceit, division, and endless instability. Absolute power brought absolute fear, and Henry VIII, in the twilight of his reign, transformed his palace into a kind of spiritual prison for himself and all those trapped within its walls. And as paranoia thickened the air, something even more unpredictable began to show, a habit that made the law itself seem as fickle and unstable as the king's own mind. Bad habit number 4. Capricious lawmaking and inconsistency. From the thick fog of suspicion and surveillance, another trouble slowly unfurled across Henry's kingdom, one that touched not only the palace walls, but every home, every church, and every corner of society. This was Henry's 4th bad habit, the habit of changing laws and policies on a whim, without warning or consistency, reflecting both his mercurial personality and the dangers of unchecked power. Over nearly 40 years of rule, Henry never hesitated to issue a flurry of new edicts, acts, and laws, sometimes in direct contradiction to his earlier decisions, all based on fleeting emotions or short-term motives. The most famous example, of course, is his bold break from the Roman Catholic Church. To legitimize his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Henry passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534 and founded the Church of England. But even after that seismic change, his religious policies swung wildly one year, persecuting Catholics. The next, hunting down radical reformers, sometimes making peace, then returning to harsh measures. Ordinary people never knew what was safe, and the world of faith became one of constant anxiety. And it was not just in matters of religion. Henry regularly changed decrees relating to land, finance, taxes, appointments and dismissals of officials, even laws about marriage and inheritance. If someone or some group fell out of favour, he would not hesitate to rewrite the rules, invent new precedents, or confiscate property to reward those more loyal to him. Law itself became an instrument of his will, rather than a stable guide for the realm. This left thousands vulnerable. What was permitted one month could become punishable by death the next. The consequences rippled out through the entire machinery of government. Ministers and nobles no longer dared to speak their minds, but waited nervously for the king's latest mood to dictate their every action. The lack of consistency pushed society into uncertainty. Priests, intellectuals, and commoners alike sometimes fled the country or lived in constant dread of being labelled traitors or heretics. The result was a bitter paradox. The greater the king's power, the more fragile the law became. Royal authority, sustained by whim and decree, gradually eroded the trust of the entire kingdom, leaving wounds that would linger long after Henry's death and haunt his children's reigns. And as the rules shifted with each gust of royal temper, the next bad habit took root, one that would stain Henry's memory with fear and blood, as he wielded punishment with a merciless hand. Bad habit number 5. Abusing power to execute and punish ruthlessly. As you move from the shifting sands of Henry's laws A darker current flows beneath the surface, the chilling habit that would stain his reign forever. The abuse of power to execute and punish mercilessly. If the capricious nature of his rule sowed anxiety, it was this fifth bad habit that truly inspired fear in the hearts of all who lived beneath his crown. Henry VIII's court was a world where the line between loyal subject and traitor was thin to the point of vanishing. A mere rumour, a sidelong glance, a moment's dissatisfaction on the king's part, any of these could spell disaster. It was not just enemies or rivals who faced Henry's wrath, but friends, confidants, and even family members. 2 of his 6 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were sent to the scaffold. And so too were trusted counsellors, high-ranking nobles, and even kin like Thomas Seymour. Sometimes, all it took was a brief, sham trial or no real trial at all. Evidence could be as flimsy as coerced confessions, or nothing more than the king's personal feeling of betrayal. Such ruthless punishments became Henry's preferred instrument for maintaining control and sowing terror. Under this shadow, the court grew silent and tense. Few dared speak honestly, offer advice, or even show emotion in his presence. The legal process often became a mere formality, with sentences determined in advance by the king's temper or suspicions. Occasionally, the punishment did not end with the individual, but extended to the shaming and dispossession of their entire family, ruining reputations, confiscating lands, and casting generations into misery. This relentless habit of using execution and cruel punishment to assert authority filled Henry's court with an atmosphere of dread and insecurity. It not only drove the king into greater isolation and coldness, but also planted seeds of instability and resentment throughout the kingdom. The wounds caused by these acts would never fully heal, leaving scars on English history that persist even centuries later. In the end, it was this spiral of suspicion and ruthlessness, this fifth bad habit, that deepened Henry's own tragedy, isolating him from all trust, feeding his paranoia, and hastening the lonely, haunted decline that awaited him at the end of his reign. And so, as silence descended and trust evaporated, another flaw crept in: a carelessness with his own health, and an almost desperate search for cures in the strangest of places. Bad habit number 6, neglecting health, reckless self-medication, and dangerous medical experiments. From the dark chill of ruthless punishments, we move into a more intimate battlefield, the silent war Henry waged against his own body. The 6th bad habit that marked his decline was a persistent neglect of his health, reckless self-medication, and a willingness to try hazardous medical experiments. Once, Henry had been celebrated as an athlete, a vigorous hunter, and a master of sports. But after the traumatic injury in the year 1536, and as his weight spiraled out of control, he abandoned every healthy routine. Exercise faded from his daily life, replaced by endless banquets and rivers of wine and ale. Advice from doctors and well-meaning courtiers went ignored, as Henry sank deeper into a cycle of indulgence and stagnation. Yet the most dangerous aspect of this neglect was his obsession with finding a cure, any cure for his ever-worsening ailments. Instead of placing his trust in careful medical guidance, Henry often seized upon rumours, folk remedies, or the latest superstitions that swept through the court. He experimented with concoctions containing arsenic and mercury, tried bizarre ointments and unproven poultices, and even allowed leeches to draw out the bad humours. Each new treatment, rather than bringing relief, weakened him further. Wounds grew infected, ulcers worsened, and pain became his constant companion. The court was crowded with quacks and self-proclaimed healers. Eager to exploit the king's desperation, Henry was a willing subject, eager to test any new cure, no matter how outlandish or dangerous. Sometimes, he forced his official physicians to combine multiple risky treatments at once, binding wounds with chemicals, applying strange salves, or using unknown drugs. The result was a steady deterioration of both body and spirit. As each remedy failed, Henry found himself caught in a cycle of hope and disappointment, slipping ever deeper into a maze of chronic illness and suffering. Ironically, the more desperately he tried to heal by any means necessary, the worse his situation became. His body withered and his mind grew heavy with frustration, infection, and despair. The endless experimentation left him physically broken and mentally drained, turning his final years into a struggle not just with the outside world, but within himself. This cautionary tale reminds us that neglecting one's health, placing blind faith in unproven cures, and ignoring sound advice can have devastating consequences, no matter how high one's station. Henry's downfall was as much the result of misguided self-treatment as it was the machinations of court politics. As his body weakened, other appetites surged in his place, leading to yet another destructive pattern: a restless, insatiable heart and a royal life defined by a trail of abandoned loves, bad habit number 7 emotional indulgence, and changing wives like changing clothes, from failed cures and wasted remedies. The story drifts toward matters of the heart, a realm where Henry VIII, too, was ruled by appetite and impulse. The 7th bad habit that left a mark on his life and legacy was his emotional recklessness and the ease with which he changed wives, as casually as one might change garments. Henry's reputation for love and passion is legendary, not simply because he had 6 wives, a number that would stun any royal court, but for the instability and drama he brought to every relationship. From his youth, Henry enjoyed the thrill of courtly flirtation, easily enchanted by the beauty of ladies at court, and unafraid to pursue romances outside the bounds of propriety, rank, or religious expectation. His flirtations were not limited to harmless words. When his interest in a wife faded, or when political needs shifted, he did not hesitate to end marriages, sometimes through divorce, sometimes through execution. Each of Henry's marriages bore the mark of calculation and turmoil. He defied Rome and tore his country from the Catholic Church to divorce Catherine of Aragon and wed Anne Boleyn, only to later execute Anne on questionable charges when he grew suspicious and disappointed. Jane Seymour, whom he cherished, died soon after giving birth to a son. Anne of Cleves was dismissed after only a few months, and Catherine Howard was executed for alleged adultery. His 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, was the only one to outlive him. Alongside these formal unions were endless rumours of affairs with noble women, maids, and women of lower rank. This habit of changing wives as easily as changing clothes did not simply tarnish Henry's image in the eyes of his court and subjects. It also shattered royal stability and left a trail of personal tragedy and social unrest. Women could be crowned queen one night, only to be deposed, imprisoned, or executed soon after. Even Henry's children were caught in this vortex of shifting loyalties and romantic upheaval, leading to bitter inheritance disputes and deep divisions that echoed through generations. In the end, this self-indulgent and impulsive approach to love left Henry more isolated than ever. Unable to trust or be truly close to anyone, history remembers him not only as a king of many wives, but as a man who paid a steep price for his lack of faithfulness, for his abuse of power in private life, and for disregarding the deeper values of family, honor, and genuine affection. From broken hearts and failed marriages, the tale now edges toward another dangerous flaw, an impulsiveness not just in love, but in the decisions that steered an entire kingdom. Bad habit number 8. Rash political decisions, letting emotion override reason. After a lifetime of restless affairs and romantic chaos, Henry's impulsiveness seeped into every corner of his rule, becoming the 8th bad habit that would haunt his legacy, making critical political decisions based on emotion, ego, and impulse rather than reason, national interest, or wise counsel. Throughout his nearly 4 decades on the throne, Henry's reign was marked by a series of dramatic, often abrupt shifts in policy, many triggered not by strategy, but by personal anger, wounded pride, or fleeting desires. His most infamous decision, severing England from the Catholic Church, was less about theological conviction and more about his determination to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. For this, he risked war, persecuted clergy, and seized church property, reshaping the kingdom to suit his personal needs rather than the common good. But it was not only in matters of religion. Purges, appointments, and dismissals of key officials, alliances broken and new ones forged. Many of these choices were the result of a rumour, a moment's rage, or a blow to Henry's ego. He would imprison, exile, or execute long-serving advisers and favourites over unsubstantiated gossip or unproven accusations, paying little heed to the lasting consequences for the machinery of state. Henry's notorious habit of starving out or isolating former allies created a court riddled with anxiety. Ministers and nobles grew wary of expressing their opinions, knowing that a single disagreement or the slightest misstep could mean disgrace or death. Even the social and religious life of the kingdom was thrown into confusion, as shifting laws and unpredictable royal moods left communities divided and uncertain. Over time, the lack of rational leadership left a bitter mark. After Henry's death, England was riven by fierce conflict problems rooted in the king's impulsive decisions and the rivalries he sowed. It became clear that unchecked power, wielded on the whim of a single man, endangered not just individuals, but the stability of an entire nation. Henry VIII's tendency to put feelings before reason stands as a warning for all rulers who come after the danger of absolute power lies not only in its reach, but in its capacity to turn a great king into the architect of his own undoing. As the realm struggled beneath the weight of shifting allegiances and edicts, another shadow lengthened an emotional coldness and a growing inability to show compassion even to those closest to him. Bad habit number 9. Lack of empathy and coldness toward loved ones. As Henry's impulsive decisions and unchecked emotions unsettled the entire kingdom, another flaw began to corrode. The very heart of his reign, his 9th bad habit, a marked lack of empathy. A chilling willingness to turn against even those closest to him. To Henry VIII. Family ties, friendship, or loyalty often amounted to little more than temporary arrangements, easily sacrificed when suspicion or dissatisfaction crept in. Throughout his long rule, he demonstrated time and again a readiness to punish, exile, or even execute those who had once been dear to him. 2 wives he once professed to love, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were beheaded on the basis of questionable charges. Condemned, as soon as he felt betrayed or disappointed. Sir Thomas More, his old friend and one of England's greatest minds, was sentenced to death simply for refusing to endorse Henry's break with the Catholic Church. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of much of Henry's power, met the same fate. Cast aside after a single political miscalculation or minor disagreement, this emotional coldness extended even to his own children. His eldest daughter Mary was stripped of her inheritance, kept under strict house arrest, and nearly charged with treason, her only crime, refusing to accept her stepmother. Edward, though the son Henry had longed for, grew up in a palace divided by suspicion, rivalry, and a profound absence of warmth beyond family. Trusted courtiers and nobles were routinely replaced without regret as soon as they fell out of favour or failed to please the king. Such a lack of compassion transformed the English court into a place of constant anxiety. Loyalty and affection survived only as long as they served the king's immediate interests. This did not just isolate Henry, leaving him ever more alone in his later years. It also fostered an enduring legacy of distrust and sorrow, a monarchy rooted in fear and suspicion rather than mutual respect or genuine human connection. For Henry himself, the absence of empathy was not just a political flaw but a personal tragedy. As the years wore on, Surrounded by sycophants and haunted by memories of friends lost and bridges burned, the king's spirit grew colder, his loneliness more profound. In the end, it was this deep emotional isolation that compounded his mental anguish and contributed to his bitter, haunted decline. With each broken bond, the king's world shrank, leaving him with little but memories, regrets, and the cold comfort of power, a cautionary tale about the human cost of a heart turned to stone. And so, as the palace halls grew emptier, another bad habit lingered, one that would seal his fate. As the king neglected the very foundation of his own survival, bad habit number 10, neglecting physical exercise and allowing illness to take over after, exploring Henry's emotional coldness and lack of empathy, we reach a quieter, yet equally damaging, bad habit, the steady neglect of his physical well-being. The 10th bad habit that shadowed Henry VIII was his growing indifference toward exercise and self-care, letting laziness and chronic illness gradually consume him. When he was young, Henry was a true symbol of Renaissance vitality. He played tennis, rode horses, hunted, and jousted, each activity painting the image of a powerful, energetic prince, admired across Europe for his strength and athleticism. For many years, these habits helped define his rule and public image, but everything changed after the accident in the year 1536. As the pain from his injuries increased, and his weight soared past 180 kilograms, Henry lost all motivation or ability to keep up any form of regular exercise. Rather than struggle to maintain his health, he surrendered to endless feasts, heavy drinking, and long, idle days within the palace walls. Eventually, he could no longer walk unaided, relying on a system of pulleys and a host of servants to move him from one room to the next. The result was a devastating downward spiral. Without exercise, Henry's health problems multiplied. His waistline ballooned beyond 130 centimeters. His limbs grew swollen and ulcerated. Infections set in, and every movement became a trial of pain. This physical decline fed into his mental state. He grew irritable, anxious, and increasingly removed from the everyday life of his court and country. He no longer attended council meetings or public events as before, isolating himself even further. His refusal to maintain his health led to almost total dependence on his attendants and palace infrastructure. By the end of his life, Henry could not dress, move, or even perform the simplest tasks without help from dozens of servants. This loss of independence was not merely a result of disease, but a reflection of his disregard for the discipline and perseverance required to sustain health, an element every ruler, and indeed every individual, must respect. Ultimately, Henry's neglect of physical exercise and self-care sealed his fate, contributing to the tragic and humiliating final chapter of his reign. It stands as a silent lesson about the price of complacency, the insidious dangers of unchecked habits, and the importance of cherishing the body as both foundation and frontier of every human life. Even the mightiest of kings cannot outrun the consequences of self-neglect. One more thread in the tapestry of downfall that history weaves for those who ignore the simplest, most universal laws of all. As the lights fade in the Tudor palace, the story of Henry VIII leaves behind not only the echoes of royal tragedy, but also a profound lesson for every generation. This is not simply a tale about power, about a king who could change the destiny of a nation with a mere wave of his hand, but a story about humanity with all its small habits, daily choices that seem harmless at first, but ultimately accumulate into fate and tragedy. The greatest value this story offers is a reminder of the limits of power, the price of indulgence, selfishness, and complacency in both thought and action. Through each of Henry VIII's bad habits, from gluttony and quick temper to suspicion, impulsive lawmaking, the abuse of power, coldness toward loved ones, and neglect of health, we realize that even the greatest empires can collapse. because of the smallest things that arise from within. Looking at modern times, the story of Henry VIII still holds true value. It reminds us that power, money, beauty, or fame can all cloud reason and pull people into the whirlpool of bad habits and complacency if we do not know when to stop, to look within ourselves. Anyone can turn their own life into a great tragedy, not just for themselves, but for their family and the wider community. Small habits, if left unchecked, can become the very chains that imprison our own destiny. Through this video, we learn that power does not last forever, and that every great thing can be worn down by personal habits and choices. True success only comes when one can control oneself, remain humble before one's limits, and cherish both physical and mental health, as well as sincere affection for loved ones. The lesson from Henry VIII, whether king or commoner, is a gentle yet powerful reminder: start changing from the smallest things so that tragedy does not repeat itself in our own modern lives.